Hello, and welcome to another video from the team here at Money Without Debt. Today, in the third part of our video tour explaining modern money, we look back in history to discover how our money supply came to be issued as debt by private banks. Two major changes need discussing here. The first is the establishment of the misleadingly named Bank of England in 1694, the creation of which set the model for central banks all over the world. Back in 1690, William III, the then King of England, needed money to rebuild his navy shattered in defeats to France, culminating in the defeat at Beachy Head. In the 1690s, money was still backed by gold that the king didn't have and couldn't raise through taxes, so he turned to some of the wealthiest people in England for a loan. In return, they demanded an extraordinary price. They were to become the issuers of the nation's money supply and be allowed to loan it back with interest to the government and private borrowers. In exchange for £1.2 million in gold bullion, the king's creditors formed the governor and company of the Bank of England. This private company became the nation's bankers and had freedom to issue and loan banknotes free of charge in the pursuit of their own profit. Now, if you are thinking that it's pretty stupid for a sovereign nation to meekly hand over the right to create its own money to a private company, you're right, it is amazingly stupid. What's worse is that the formation of the Bank of England became the model for central banks all over the world, setting the precedent that money cannot be created by a government in the national interest, but must be borrowed from a private third party. When you consider that modern money is simply digits in a computer system, backed by nothing at all, the logic of affording a private cartel of banks a monopoly over a nation's money supply is even more bizarre, and yet that is the unquestioned reality of sovereign finance today. The Bank of England is now wholly owned by the Treasury, but to this day is forbidden from loaning money directly to the government that owns it, obliging the current UK government, like governments all over the world, to borrow their own currency from the international money markets. The current sovereign debt crisis that is stalking Europe with catastrophic consequences is a paper tiger that could be confronted easily. Vested interest and a historical accident are all that created the current system of so-called central banks. No sovereign nation needs to borrow its own money supply from private banks. It is the people of a nation, through their hard work and enterprise, that create its wealth. They shouldn't have to hand over crippling debt repayments just to have a means of exchange. A basic public utility like money could be issued free of charge by any government. Then there would be no need for money changes, bank bailouts, or austerity. As extraordinary as the travesty of central banks is, what happened to the money supply for private individuals like you and I is even more unfair and bizarre. We have seen in the previous two videos how a cartel of private banks in the UK gets to issue the money that we spend in the economy as debt. The numbers you see in your current account are just numbers. They are not backed with gold, banknotes, coins, or anything else. They are an accounting entry created when banks make loans. But how did this come about? How did we end up using this gyro checkbook money for almost everything we buy? Well, to understand that, we must look back in history again, to when money was backed by a precious metal like gold or silver, to the days of gold and silversmiths. Let's picture the story of a goldsmith for modern banking was founded by them. Paul Grignon's Money is Debt video, which you can watch in full on YouTube, provides us with some of the images for this tale. When people use gold and silver coins as a means of exchange, Gold and silversmiths were at the heart of the monetary system. They were artisans who created coins of standard size, weight, and purity as part of their trade. Goldsmiths were to become the world's first bankers, but to begin with they made their living in three ways. They worked with the precious metals, as you would expect. They rented space in their vaults for people to store gold and silver. When people deposited gold, the goldsmith would issue them with a receipt. Some goldsmiths also offered loans of their own gold, for which they charged interest. After a while, the goldsmith in our story noticed something. People rarely seemed to be collecting their gold back from the goldsmith's vault. What was going on? Well, people had started to use the receipts issued by the goldsmith as money. They were much lighter and easier to carry around than gold coins, and were backed by the gold held in the vault. The popularity of this new paper money grew and grew, and when the goldsmith was making loans of his gold, people started asking for a receipt instead of the actual gold. This gave the goldsmith an idea. As people now rarely came to take out their gold, he could now loan out paper money against his depositors' gold. As long as the loan was repaid, his depositors need never know, and he could pocket a lot more interest if he made loans against their gold in addition to his own. This was in effect a form of fraud, as the gold wasn't his to loan, but unless everyone who ended up owning a receipt for the gold came to collect their gold all at once, he knew he would never be found out. This process was the birth of modern banking, what we call today fractional reserve banking, where a bank only has to hold a tiny fraction of deposits in order to lend a much larger amount of money. Later, as paper money gained more and more acceptance, he had another idea. He realized he didn't need any gold at all in order to issue a receipt. As long as someone was willing to sign a loan agreement, he could issue some paper money and balance that liability against the borrower's promise to pay it back. The goldsmith now had a fantastic new income stream for which he didn't need even the pretense of gold. As long as he could find a borrower, he could just create the money out of nothing and pocket all the interest the borrower paid. This was the birth of money as debt that we still have today. The money didn't come into existence until someone took on a loan, and the goldsmith could extract value from the economy by simply writing out a piece of paper. For a while, all was well, and the goldsmith became very wealthy, and the economy prospered with all the money that was in circulation, creating an economic boom. But with this artificially created boom there soon came a bust. All the new paper money issued by the goldsmith pushed up prices, inflation rose, and the economy collapsed. Lots of people could no longer repay their loans to the goldsmith, and rumours spread that he no longer had enough gold to cover all the receipts he had issued. People rushed to get their gold back from the goldsmith. The first bank run. The goldsmith didn't have enough gold to cover all the receipts he had issued, and the insolvent bank collapsed, leading to economic depression and personal ruin for many of those that had trusted the goldsmith. The story outlined has happened many times in the history of banking, with an economic boom created by the credit issued by banks, and then a collapse, with bank runs and an economic depression. Indeed, the recent deregulation of banks and financial markets has seen this familiar pattern return with even more destructive force today. Aware of this cycle and the destabilizing role played by private banks, the then Conservative government of Sir Robert Peel passed the Bank Charter Act in 1844, which forbade banks from issuing banknotes. Crucially, however, the Act did not forbid banks from continuing to issue bank credit. Now, the easiest way to understand this kind of money is to think of it as book money, for the process simply involves putting entries into accounting ledgers. With ledger book money, People taking on a loan from a bank were not loaned money as such, but given credit notes, a cheque, with which they could pay bills and settle debts where the bank's credit was accepted. At that time, after many banking collapses, people were wary of bank credit, and the acceptance of this chequebook money was limited, which explains why Sir Robert Peel's government felt no need to regulate it at that time. Now, the loans entered in bank ledger books didn't legally represent new money as such. The banks were now forbidden from creating that, and still are. But as long as any credit note in the ledger was matched by a corresponding debt, then legally no new money had been created, although in practice the borrower could, where bank credit was accepted, spend this debt money just as easily as notes and coins. If we now fast forward a bit to 1946, an astonishing change gradually occurred. Government-issued notes and coins now only made up 46% of the money supply. The rest was chequebook money, created out of thin air when banks extended loans. If we fast forward again to the present day, the gradual takeover by chequebook money is almost complete. In modern Britain, the old-style ledgers have been replaced by computer systems and cheques with debit and credit cards, but the underlying dynamic of creating money when extending loans is unchanged. Today, money created via a bank loan makes up 97% of all financial transactions. This is the simple history which the banking industry tries very hard to hide, in complex language akin to a modern-day Latin Mass. If the majority of the populace knew that their money supply had been privatized by stealth in a few short decades, there would surely be mass protest. And yet this is exactly what has happened. Chequebook credit is now almost the only form of money available, and deregulation of the financial markets has removed almost any constraint to banks issuing it. So it's no surprise that financial chaos has once again been unleashed, not just in the UK, not just in Europe, but all over the world, with booms and busts, bank bailouts, austerity, depressions, mass unemployment and spiraling social inequality. As soon as you understand the basics of the history of money as debt, the whole situation becomes clear, and the need to change it obviously urgent. Thanks for listening. Now move on to the fourth video in our tour of modern money, which examines why economists and economic pundits simply don't understand money, and how that stifles the debate we need to have.